So, good evening. You know I'm going to try that again. Good evening. All right, I guess it should be more like good evening. So on behalf of KPCC Southern California Public Radio, I'd like to welcome you here to the Crawford Family Forum. By a show of hands, how many people are joining us tonight for the first time for a live event? Raise them high, don't be shy. Great, thank you so much for coming. For those of you who didn't raise your hands, thank you so much for coming back. All right, we're gonna keep the polls going, right? By a show of hands, how many people are KPCC members? Great, thank you so much for supporting KPCC. You make our events, what we do on air and online possible. If you didn't raise your hand, and as a flashback to just a week ago, you can call 866-888-5722 or click and join at kpcc.org. No, we're not coming back. That would probably be the worst classic tale or horror tale that we could tell this evening, right? The pledge drive, the rest of the year. My name's John Cohn. I'm the managing producer of Forum Programs and Live Events. And so I have the great privilege of overseeing everything we do with an in-person audience. A lot of what we do happens in the Crawford Family Forum, but then we also travel around Southern California doing all types of activities. Tonight's event is going to be what we call live to tape, which means we record roughly around the time that a show takes in its broadcast format. So we'll be recording, and then we'll also be live video streaming. So a little bit of housekeeping for you guys. If you have devices, please feel free to use them, take photos, tweet, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. But we do ask that you put them on silent, and if you take photos, please don't use your flash. The other thing, and this feels a little bit more like traditional theater, we candy, help yourself, eat as much as possible. But if you could keep the wrinkly, crinkly kind of sound with them to a minimum, that'd be great. It reminds me of the matinee shows in theaters around Los Angeles. They add that to the welcome speech. So without further ado, I'll get out of your way, and I'd like to introduce you to your host for the evening and the host of Off Ramp, John Raby.
Wow, that's what you look like. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. We're going to, as John mentioned, we're doing this as for the radio broadcast of Off Ramp, Saturday at noon and Sunday night at 6 o'clock. So you'll want to hear yourself on the radio, right? Yeah. Clapping or screaming or laughing if that's appropriate, or tittering nervously because we've touched on some topic that's, you know, a little scary, a little uncomfortable. So do that with gusto, please. Applaud loudly because we don't have the mics turned up too loud in the house. And then afterwards, we'll be hanging out in the lobby, and we'd love to see you there. And we're even selling books. Oh, and did everybody get a raffle ticket? We're going to be doing a drawing for 3 books that Les will sign. So we're delighted to do that. For some reason, they were not willing to give away 500 books. They're very weird like that. We're going to take 2 breaks that are very short inside the program, and they're just, it's, you know how when I do Off Ramp, I say coming up in just a couple minutes, we're going to do this and that, and then there's the funding credit and the weather and the news, and then we go back to the show. So we'll do those little 1-minute breaks and reset the microphone and stuff like that. Don't leave, don't go unless you really have to go. But try not to go and just don't do anything then. Just kind of sit there. Sorry. I think that's it. Okay. Les, do you want to come on up now? May I introduce? This. You can applaud now and again. This is Les Klinger, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm noticing the ritual circle of candles here. Is something bad going to happen?
Yes.
Oh, good.
We'll tell you what that is later.
Good.
Everybody ready? Are we good? Yeah. Okay. All right. And Dave, I'm going to start now. Just give me a thumbs up. The following program includes content that may be too intense for young listeners. Hello, everyone. I'm John Raby from the Crawford Family Forum at the Moan Broadcast Center. This is an off-ramp Halloween special. It's Thursday night here at the Forum, just 2 days before Halloween, and we're here to explore our darkest fears and most base desires, to dig into the deep recesses of the human mind, and to force ourselves to look under the bed when the lights go off, to reach into the hole in the wall when you hear the scratching of rats inside. We'll be telling you horror stories tonight, stories you've probably never heard, stories from before TV and radio and cell phones, when storytelling was all we had. We gathered around a fire whose light and warmth drew only a small circle of safety around us, and we retold the tales about what's out there, just beyond the light, about an object used for such terrible things it gives bad dreams to whoever touches it, or a horrible family secret, or those who would sacrifice a child for their own ends. The lights are low here at the Crawford Family Forum, and waiting in the wings are 3 readers who will bring these stories alive for you. But first, let me introduce my guest here at the Crawford Family Forum. He's best known for his annotated editions of Sherlock Holmes, H.P. Lovecraft, and Dracula. His newest book is In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe, Classic Tales of Horror from 1816 to 1914. It's a new collection of stories that deserve a place among the best of the horror genre. Les Klinger, welcome back to Off Ramp.
Thanks, John.
So Les, we'll be talking tonight mostly about writers our audience knows little to nothing about, and you say we can blame Edgar Allan Poe for that.
Yes. Everybody thinks horror, they think Poe. I mean, that's the master of the genre. He wasn't all that successful during his lifetime, at least not in the United States. But by the end of the 19th century, he was drawn into the American pantheon of great writers, and he's the big name. So what I wanted to do in the course of some of my studies, I'd come across these other stories, and I had the idea that unfortunately these great writers had gotten lost in the shadow of Poe, and I wanted to share them with other friends.
And it goes backwards and forwards, too. People who were writing before Poe,
Yes.
people who wrote after Poe, all we think of as Poe.
Yes, and one or two of the writers clearly influenced Poe. For example, E.T.A. Hoffmann, who was a very popular German writer at the beginning of the 19th century.
Tales of Hoffmann, right?
Yes, and Poe knew his stories well and wanted to write stories in that style. But these days, nobody reads Hoffmann.
No, Poe sucked all the air out of the crypt.
I think that's right.
We have wonderful readers with us tonight who are going to share 3 of these stories. Our first story is Desiree's Baby, written in 1893 by Kate Chopin. Before we hear the reading, how did you select it?
Well, Chopin is somebody that's always fascinated me. She was a Southern American who was, again, somewhat obscure as a writer and more recently rediscovered as one of the leading feminist writers. Her novel, The Awakening, now I think is widely taught. And when I discovered this little story by her, it just struck me as the perfect combination of sort of feminist literature and really horrible stuff. I mean, it's a story, as you'll see, about, I won't reveal the details, but it's about that deep fear that we all have of the other.
Here to read Kate Chopin's Desiree's Baby is an actor who won a Tony Award in August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone, a Helen Hayes Award in Neil Simon's Proposals, and an Obie in Lee Blessing's Going to St. Ives. She's also appeared on Lost and many other TV shows. Please join me in welcoming L. Scott Caldwell.
As the day was pleasant, Madame Valmont drove over to L'Abri to see Desiree and the baby. It made her laugh to think of Desiree with a baby. Why, it seemed but yesterday that Desiree was little more than a baby herself, when Monsieur, in riding through the gateway of Valmont, had found her, lying asleep in the shadow of the big stone pillar. The little one awoke in his arms and began to cry for Dada. That was as much as she could do or say. Some people thought she might have strayed there of her own accord, for she was of toddling age. The prevailing belief was that she had been purposefully left by a party of Texans whose canvas-covered wagon, late in the day, had crossed the ferry that Cotton Mayes kept just below the plantation. In time, Madame Valmont abandoned every speculation but the one that Desiree had been sent to her by a beneficent God to be the child of her affection, seeing that she was without child of the flesh. The girl grew to be beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Valmont. It was no wonder when she stood one day against the stone pillar in whose shadow she had lain asleep 18 years before, that Armand Aubigné, riding by and seeing her there, had fallen in love with her. That was the way all the Aubignés fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he had known her since his father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8 after his mother died there. The passion that awoke in him that day when he saw her at the gate swept along like an avalanche or a prairie fire, or like anything that drives headlong over all obstacles. Monsieur Valmont grew practical and wanted things well considered, that is, the girl's obscure origin. Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. What did it matter about a name when he could give her one of the oldest and proudest in Louisiana? He ordered the wedding gifts from Paris and contained himself with what patience he could until it arrived. Then they were married. Madame Valmont had not seen Desiree and the baby for 4 weeks. When she reached La Brise, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigné having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well ever to leave it. The roof came down steep and black like a hood, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that encircled the yellow stuccoed house. Big, solemn oaks grew close to it, and their thick-leaved, far-reaching branches shadowed it like a shroud. Young Aubigné's rule was a strict one, too, and under it his slaves had forgotten how to be gay, as they had been during the old master's easygoing and indulgent lifetime. The young mother was recovering slowly and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon a couch. The baby was beside her, upon her arm where he had fallen asleep at her breast. The yellow nurse woman sat beside a window, fanning herself. Madame Valmont bent her portly figure over Desiree and kissed her, holding her an instant tenderly in her arms. Then she turned to the child. "This is not the baby, ce n'est pas de bébé," she exclaimed in startled tones. "I knew you would be astonished," laughed Desiree, "at the way he has grown. The little cochon de lait, little piglet, look at his legs, Mama, and his hands and fingernails, real fingernails. Zandrine had to cut them this morning. Isn't it true, Zandrine?" The nurse bowed her turbaned head majestically. Merci, madame. And the way he cries, went on Desiree, is deafening. Armand heard him the other day as far away as La Blanche's cabin. Madame Valmont had never removed her eyes from the baby. She lifted it and walked with it over to the window that was lightest. She scanned the baby narrowly, then looked as searchingly at Zandrine, whose face was turned to gaze across the fields. Yes, the child has grown, has changed, said Madame Valmont slowly as she replaced the baby beside its mother. What does Armand say? Desiree's face became suffused with a glow that was happiness itself. Armand is the proudest father in the parish, I believe chiefly because it is a boy to bear his name, though he says not that he would have loved a girl as well. But I know it isn't true. I know he says that to please me. And Mama, she added, drawing Madame Valmont's head down to her and speaking in a whisper, he hasn't punished one of them. Not one of them since baby is born. Even Negrilon, who pretended to have burnt his leg that he might rest from work. Armand only laughed and said Negrilon was a great scamp. Oh, Mama, I'm so happy it frightens me. What Desiree said was true. Marriage and later the birth of his son had softened Armand Aubigny's imperious and exacting nature greatly. This was what made the gentle Desiree so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled, but loved him. When he smiled, she asked no greater blessing of God. But Armand's dark, handsome face had not been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her. When the baby was 3 months old, Desiree awoke one day to the conviction that there was something in the air menacing her peace. It was at first too subtle to grasp. It had only been a disquieting suggestion, an air of mystery among the slaves, unexpected visits from far-off neighbors who could hardly account for their coming. Then, a strange and awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not ask him to explain. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes, from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. He absented himself from home, and when there, avoided her presence and that of her child without excuse. And the very spirit of Satan seemed suddenly to take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. Desiree was miserable enough to die. She sat in her room one hot afternoon in her peignoir, listlessly drawing her fingers through the strands of her long, silky, brown hair that hung about her shoulders. The baby, half naked, lay asleep upon its own great mahogany bed that was like a sumptuous throne with its satin-lined half canopy. One of La Blanche's little quadroon boys, half naked too, stood, fanning the baby slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. Desiree's eyes had been fixed absently and sadly upon the baby while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that she felt closing in around her. She looked from her child to the boy who stood beside him, and back again, over and over. It was a cry she could not help, which she was not conscious of having uttered. The blood turned like ice in her veins, and a clammy moisture gathered upon her face. She tried to speak to the little quadroon boy, but no sound would come at first. When he heard his name uttered, he looked up, and his mistress was pointing to the door. He laid aside the great soft fan and obediently stole away over the polished floor on his bare tiptoes. Desiree stayed motionless, with gaze riveted upon her child, and her face the picture of fright. Presently, her husband entered the room, and without noticing her, went to a table and began to search among the table for some papers which covered it. "Aman," she called to him. "Aman," she said again. Then she rose and tottered toward him. "Aman," she panted once more, clutching his arms. "Look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me." He coldly but gently loosened her fingers from about his arm and thrust the hand away from him. "Tell me what it means," she cried despairingly. "It means," he answered, "that the child is not white. It means that you are not white." A quick conception of all that this accusation meant for her nerved her with the unexpected courage to deny it. "It is a lie. It is not true. I am white. Look at my hair. It is brown, and my eyes are gray. You know they are gray. And my skin is fair." Seizing his wrist, "Look at my hand. Whiter than yours, Aman." "As white as La Blanche's," he returned cruelly, and went away, leaving her alone with their child. When she could hold a pen in her hand, she sent a despairing letter to Madame Valmont. "My mother, they tell me I am not white. Aman has told me I am not white. For God's sakes, tell them it is not true. You must know it is not true. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live." The answer came, and it was brief. "My own Desiree, come home to Valmont, back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child." When the letter reached Desiree, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it open upon the desk before which he sat. She was like a stone image, silent, white, motionless after she placed it there. In silence, he ran his cold eyes over the written words. He said nothing. "Shall I go, Aman?" she asked in tone sharp with agonized suspense. Yes, go. Do you want me to go? Yes, I want you to go. Armand thought Almighty God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him, and felt somehow that he was paying God back when he stabbed thus into his wife's soul. Moreover, he no longer loved her because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name. She turned away like one stunned by a blow and walked slowly towards the door, hoping he would call her back. Goodbye, Armand. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate. Desiree went in search of her child. Zandrine was pacing the somber gallery with the baby. She took the little one from the nurse's arms with no word of explanation, and descending the steps, walked away under the live oak branches. It was an October afternoon. The sun was sinking. Out in the still fields, the slaves were picking cotton. Desiree had not changed from the thin white garment nor the slippers she wore. Her hair was uncovered, and the sun's rays brought a golden gleam from its brown meshes. She did not take the broad, beaten road which led to the far-off plantation of Valmont. She walked instead across a deserted field where the stubble bruised her tender feet so delicately shod and tore her thin gown to shreds. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick along the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again. Some weeks later, there was a curious scene enacted at Raby. In the center of the smoothly swept backyard was a great bonfire. Armand Aubigné sat in the wide hallway that commanded a view of the spectacle, and it was he who dealt out to half a dozen slaves the material which kept this fire ablaze. A graceful cradle of willow, with all its dainty furbishings, was laid upon the pyre, which had already been fed with the richness of a priceless baby layette. Then there were silk gowns and velvet and satin ones added to these, laces too, and embroideries, bonnets and gloves, for the wedding gifts had been of rare quality. The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Desiree had sent to him during the days of their courtship. There was the remnant of one letter stuck in the back of a drawer from which he took them. But it was not Desiree's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love. But above all, she wrote, night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery.
L. Scott Caldwell reading Desiree's Baby, written in 1893 by Kate Chopin.
Wow. I mean, it's, you know, I read these stories when I collect them, and they're just completely different to hear them read with that power. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's why we gather around the fire, to hear people tell these stories. Was this the first horror story where racism is the horror?
Well, I think in a direct sense it is. Frankenstein, which is certainly one of the earliest horror stories, is really very much about race and beings that are not like ourselves. But this is one of the earliest short stories that's directly about black and white relations, let's say.
Yep, 1893, very progressive. Would you? And you said that Kate Chopin wrote works that are considered feminist, that were feminist.
Yes.
Is this a feminist horror story as well as one that's about racism?
One could say that. And we're not able to read another one of the stories in the collection tonight, The Yellow Wallpaper, also taught in feminist studies. I think in the 19th century, we had women writers of great power who were able to express the woman's experience. And there was actually a market for short stories, and women were quite successful in selling their stories. And that sort of got lost, too, that there were voices of women in the 19th century that were only later discovered by the suffragettes and the feminists of the late 19th and early 20th century.
That's Les Klinger, editor and annotator of In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe, Classic Tales of Horror. You're listening to an Off-Ramp Halloween special recorded live at the Crawford Family Forum on Thursday night before Halloween. Coming up in about 20 minutes, when Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to, he could tell a hellish horror story without Sherlock Holmes. In just a couple of minutes after the break, Saki, one of the masters of the short story, who probably said, "No gifts, please," when he threw a party. This is Off-Ramp. So we're just going to take a couple minutes now to rearrange the stand, and this is where you'd hear the funding credit and the news and a little bit of music, a promo. Coming up on Prairie Home Companion tonight.
Right. So did anybody
Guy Noir.
Anybody sort of see that ending coming? Or even the horror? It's
Well, it just slowly builds.
Yes, it does.
It's and you keep dreading. You know something's going to happen, and that. So
well, of course, because we're here.
So did he know that he also had black blood?
No, that's the whole point. He didn't know.
Before he sent her off.
No.
He had no idea.
He had no idea.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. This is even worse. You know, this is 19th century horror. It isn't so much about violence. We should mention.
Oh, wait, don't say too many good things.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hold that thought.
Okay. And Dave, just waiting for the thumbs up. We're good. Okay. Hit the music. Welcome back to Off-Ramp. This week, coming to you live from the Crawford Family Forum, I'm John Raby with Les Klinger, editor and annotator of In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe, Classic Tales of Horror, 1816 to 1914, a new collection of great old stories. Les, how do you define, what precisely is horror?
Well, Poe himself suggested that his aim when he wrote what we now call his horror stories was to evoke a mood. He was trying to build an emotion, and the emotion was a combination of shock and awe and wonder. And I've often wondered myself, why do we like that sort of thing? Why do we want to hear these kinds of stories? Now, I have my own sort of crackpot psychoanalytic theory, which is that it's practice, that we're rehearsing how we ourselves would deal with shocking, terrible, horrible things. And this is the best way to practice because we have total control. We can close the book. We can put our fingers in our ears and say, I don't want to hear anymore. And that's why we like it, because this is a controlled way to experience these thrilling, literally thrilling emotions.
I think it's more like a roller coaster. You get on it, you know you're going to live to the end, but you're going to have the fear of death, imminent death, horrible things happening to you, and you make it through, and that's a huge, it's an adrenaline rush. It actually becomes, it's like crack.
Right, and I mean, we're not disagreeing. I think it's the same thing. It's a very tightly controlled experience of that huge physical pleasure of adrenaline and fear and all that stuff.
How and where did people in the 1800s get their horror stories?
Well, so there were several developments in the 19th century that led to the explosion of this kind of material. One was, it's hard to put ourselves back into those times, but one was the growth of reading. That reading, which was once the purview only of the upper classes, was becoming more and more prevalent as the schools improved and public schools were invented, and people were getting educated and learning to read. Second, we had printing exploding. We had cheaper and more efficient printing presses, and so it was much more feasible to publish books and magazines than it had been before that. So the prices came down, and we saw inexpensive reading material. And then finally, in sort of the second half of the century, we have the railways, which means that people have time on their hands as they're traveling on the train. So we had magazines. That was the principal form of delivery. Was a tremendous growth of magazines and cheap paper novels, that later known as dime novels or yellowback novels. And so this material, this reading material, is spreading out, and it's becoming available to the middle classes, and people are reading. And the short story is the ideal form because you can read it on the train ride, and it's over. You don't have to wait for the next week's installment of your Dickens novel.
And people also read these stories to each other. They would gather together in their homes and read them. Sometimes at particular times of the year, and I want to quote one of the weirdest Christmas songs ever. It's the most wonderful time of the year. There'll be parties for hosting, marshmallows for roasting, and caroling out in the snow. And then the line that I think most Americans just blow right by, I don't think they even know it's in the song, but it goes, there'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. Americans don't tell ghost stories at Christmas, but the Brits do.
Well, A Christmas Carol is, of course,
That's
a
British.
ghost story.
Yes, and that's British.
Well, but I'm saying, I mean, even Americans read those, but read that as a Christmas tradition.
But specifically, Brits do ghost stories at Christmas.
Yes.
How come? Do we know?
I think it's just a nice way to gather the family together. You got to tell. I mean, what other kind of story are you going to tell? What story will get everybody to sit still and listen? Let's have a story about romance. No, that's going to put all the children to sleep. So, horror works.
And let's move now from Christmas to Easter. Our next story is The Easter Egg, written in 1911 by H.H. Munro, better known as Saki. Tell us a little bit about this story, about Saki.
Well, so Munro is one of those odd Europeans. He's a Scot, who never lived in Scotland, born in Italy, and died in some country in Southeast Asia. And somewhere along the line, he wanted to be a musician, but he wasn't very good at it. So he took up writing, and he was really good at that. He wrote lots of novels, and nobody reads those anymore, but he was also a prolific writer of short stories. They were witty, they had lovely twists of language, and in many cases, surprise endings. They were very popular. Many people know the most famous of his story, The Open Window, but the one that we're going to hear really got me. It's just this little gem of a story.
Like a Fabergé egg.
Just like.
To read Sake's The Easter Egg is a former child actor who sat in front of Einstein at a 3D screening of Vincent Price in House of Wax, who wrote the lyrics for Smile with Brian Wilson, who produced Ry Cooder and Randy Newman's first albums, who is a musician and singer whose voice, straight from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, is like lemonade on a shady porch on a 95-degree day. Please welcome Van Dyke Parks.
It was distinctly hard times for Lady Barbara, who came of good fighting stock and was one of the bravest women of her generation. That her son should be so undisguisedly a coward. Whatever good qualities Lester Slagby may have possessed, and he was in some respects charming, courage could never be imputed to him. As a child, he suffered from childish timidity. As a boy, from unboyish funk. And as a youth, he had exchanged unreasoning fears for thought-out basis. He was, frankly, afraid of animals, nervous with firearms, and never crossed the channel without mentally comparing the numerical proportion of lifeboats to passengers. On horseback, he seemed to require as many hands as a Hindu god, at least 4 for clutching the reins, 2 for patting the horse soothingly on the neck. Lady Barbara no longer pretended not to see her son's prevailing weakness. With her usual courage, she faced the knowledge of it squarely and mother-like, loved him nonetheless. Continental travel, anywhere away from the great tourist tracks, was a favored hobby with Lady Barbara, and Lester joined her as often as possible. Eastertide usually found her at Knobbaldheim, an upland township in one of those small princedoms that make the inconspicuous freckles on the map of Europe. A long-standing acquaintanceship with the reigning family made her a personage of due importance in the eyes of her old friend, the Burgomeister, and she was anxiously consulted by that worthy on the momentous occasion when the prince made known his intention of coming in person to open up a sanatorium outside of town. All the usual items in a program of welcome, some of them fatuous and commonplace, others quaint and charming, had been arranged for. But the Burgomeister hoped that the resourceful English lady might have something new and tasteful to suggest in the way of loyal greeting. The prince was known to the outside world, if at all, as an old-fashioned reactionary, combating modern progress, as it were, with a wooden sword. To his own people, he was known as a kindly old gentleman with a certain endearing stateliness, which had nothing of standoffishness about it. Knobbaldheim was anxious to do its best. Lady Barbara discussed the matter with Lester and 1 or 2 acquaintances in her little hotel, but ideas were difficult to come by. "Might I suggest something to the gracious lady?" asked a sallow, high-cheekboned lady to whom the Englishman had spoken once or twice, and whom she'd set down in her mind as probably a Southern Slav. Might I suggest something for the reception fest? She went on with a certain shy eagerness. Our little child here, our baby, we will dress him in a little white coat with small wings as an Easter angel, and he will carry a large white Easter egg, and inside shall be a basket of plover eggs, of which the prince is so fond, and he shall give it to his highness as Easter offering. It is so pretty an idea. We have seen it done once in Styria. Lady Barbara looked dubiously at the proposed Easter angel, a fair, wooden-faced child of about 4 years old. She had noticed him the day before in the hotel and wondered rather how such a tow-headed child could belong to such a dark-visaged couple as the woman and her husband. Probably, she thought, an adopted baby, especially as the couple were not young. Of course, gracious lady will escort the little child up to the prince, pursued the woman, but he will be quite good and do as he is told. We have some plover's eggs, shall come fresh from Vienna, said the husband. The small child and Lady Barbara seemed equally unenthusiastic about the pretty idea. Lester was openly discouraging, and when the Burgermeister heard of it, he was enchanted. The combination of sentiment and plover's eggs appealed strongly to his Teutonic mind. On the eventful day, the Easter angel, really quite prettily and quaintly dressed, was a center of kindly interest to the gala crowd marshaled to receive His Highness. The mother was unobtrusive and less fussy than most parents would have been under the circumstances, merely stipulating that she should place the Easter egg herself in the arms that had been carefully schooled how to hold the precious burden. Then Lady Barbara moved forward, the child marching stolidly and with grim determination at her side. He had been promised cakes and sweeties galore if he gave the egg well and truly to the kind old gentleman who was waiting to receive it. Lester had tried to convey to the boy privately that horrible smackings would attend any failure in his share of the proceedings, but it is doubtful if his German caused more than an immediate distress. Lady Barbara had thoughtfully prepared herself with an emergency supply of chocolates. Children may sometimes be time servers, but they do not encourage long accounts. As they approached nearer to the princely dais, Lady Barbara stood discreetly aside, and the stolid-faced child walked forward alone with a staggering but steadfast gait, encouraged by a murmur of elderly approval. Lester, standing in the front row, turned to scan the crowd for the beaming faces of the happy parents. In a side road which led to the railway station, he saw a cab, and entering the cab with every appearance of furtive haste were the dark-visaged couple who had been so plausibly eager for this pretty idea. The sharpened instinct of cowardice lit up the situation to him in one swift flash. The blood roared and surged to his head as though thousands of floodgates had been opened in his veins and arteries, and his brain was the common sluice in which all the torrents met. He saw nothing but a blur around him. Then the blood ebbed away in quick waves till his very heart seemed drained and empty, and he stood nervously, helplessly, dumbly, watching the child bearing its accursed burden with slow, relentless steps, nearer and nearer to the group that waited, sheep-like, to receive him. A fascinated curiosity compelled Lester to turn his head toward the fugitives. The cab had started at a hot pace in the direction of the station. The next moment, Lester was running faster than any of those present had ever seen a man run. And he was not running away. For that stray fraction in his life, some unwanted impulse beset him, some hint of the stock he came from, and he ran unflinchingly toward danger. He stooped and clutched at the Easter egg as one tries to scoop up the ball in a rugby football. What he meant to do with it he had not considered. The thing was to get it. But the child had been promised cakes and chocolate if it gave the egg into the hands of the kindly old gentleman. He uttered no scream, but held to his charge with limpet grip. Lester sank to his knees, tugging savagely at the tightly clasped burden. And angry cries rose from the scandalized onlookers. A questioning, threatening ring formed around him and then shrank back in recoil as he shrieked out one hideous word. Lady Barbara heard the word and saw the crowd race away like scattered sheep, saw the prince forcibly hustled away by his attendants. Also, she saw her son lying prone in an agony of overmastering terror, his spasm of daring shattered by the child's unexpected resistance, still clutching frantically as though for safety at that white satin gewgaw, unable to crawl even from his deadly neighborhood, able only to scream and scream and scream. In her brain, she was dimly conscious of balancing or striving to balance the abject shame which had flung him grandly and madly onto the point of danger. It was only for the fraction of a minute that she stood watching two entangled figures, the child and his woodenly obstinate face and body tensed with dogged resistance, limp and already nearly dead with a terror that almost stifled his screams. And over them, the long gala streamers flapping gaily in the sunshine. She never forgot this scene, but then it was the last she saw. Lady Barbara carries her scarred face with its sightless eyes as bravely as ever in the world, but at Eastertide, her friends are careful to keep from her ears any mention of the children's Easter symbol.
Van Dyke Parks reading The Easter Egg, written in 1911 by H.H. Munro.
1911, amazingly prescient, 3 years before the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand at Sarajevo. And nihilists were, of course, a well-known phenomena of the day, but this story kind of sneaks up on you.
Man. The word that the cowardly man yells must be bomb.
Must be bomb.
Wow. Stephen King's The Dead Zone is the only horror story I can think of, but I'm not an expert, that deals with political assassination, something like a horror story. What do you think it adds? This was it political verisimilitude?
What does it add? Well, I think once again it mirrors the real world. Here is a society that, as I said, has been dealing with the nihilists and bomb throwers and the Russian Revolution about to explode and things like that. And this seems to be an absolutely harmless setting. So the horror of it here is that into this incredibly nice holiday kind of setting, we have the horrors of the real world that everybody would soon know far too well from the Great War.
As Van Dyke Parks was reading, I was thinking of, and maybe it's maybe a little bit of the two voices, but the tone of the story is very much like a David Sedaris short story in its kind of formality. And I'm wondering if like Sedaris takes a little bit from this. I don't know how often you listen to David Sedaris, but there's the going through of a formal process to tell this story and then the shattering conclusion.
Yes, well, these are great writers.
Yeah.
And did people today learn from some of them? Yes, indeed.
You're listening to an Off-Ramp Halloween special live at the Crawford Family Forum. Coming up, the shattering conclusion of our night of horror stories, a story from Arthur Conan Doyle that you can really sink your teeth into. This is Off-Ramp. guys booing the pun? Oh, yes, coming up on another Prairie Home Companion, I'll be. Who knows what? I'll have a mandolin player, probably. I'll promise him a job. We'll see what happens. And Guy Noir, part 5,672. That's coming up. Wayward Cats? Is there something like that? And it'll be 90 degrees. And traffic, by the way, is heavy from on the 101, basically. Hollywood down to the 4 level, down to the border. We could do. I thought we could. Ready? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm John Raby from the Crawford Family Forum at the Moan Broadcast Center. This is Off Ramp. We're recording this show on Thursday night, just 2 days before Halloween. My guest on stage with me is Les Klinger, known for his annotated editions of Sherlock Holmes, H.P. Lovecraft, and Dracula. His newest book is In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe, Classic Tales of Horror from 1816 to 1914, a new collection of stories that deserve a place among the very best of the horror genre. Coming up, we're going to hear a horror story from Arthur Conan Doyle. First, why do horror and the short story work together so well?
Well, I think horror is really about building a mood to a moment of terror. And I think that that's very difficult to do on a sustained note. Lovecraft has done it in a few novels. Certainly Stephen King has done it well, but it's very, very difficult. The short story is really, in my mind, much more suited for sort of that effort, to get that kind of focus with the sharp point at the end.
The modern reader knows a few of the authors in your book, people like Conan Doyle, Saki, Bram Stoker. Of all the others, who do you think is the most unfairly overlooked?
Well, there's some really good stories. I mean, Hoffman, I've already mentioned, is one that has sort of faded into the background. There's a writer named Hans Ewer. My favorite story in the collection is The Sandman, is called The Spider by Hans Ewer, and it's really, really a creepy story about sort of maybe it's a ghost, maybe it's a psychic vampire. We're not quite sure, but. F. Marion Crawford, another one, an American, came from a writing family. His aunt was Julia Ward Howe. He wrote novels that were reasonably successful and some really creepy short stories. The Upper Berth, which is the story in the collection, is really one of the finest ghost stories you'll ever read. And it's just not fair that these writers don't get any credit anymore. People don't go back and read them. Even Conan Doyle and Stoker, both of them are remembered for aspects that they didn't particularly think were the best parts of their careers. Stoker actually wrote many short stories, and the one that's in the book, The Squaw, is from a posthumous collection put out by his wife. And Doyle was a prolific writer of all kinds of fiction. He, in fact, was sick and tired of writing Sherlock Holmes stories. And he wrote many science fiction stories, horror stories, brilliant humorous tales about the Napoleonic War, a character named Brigadier Gerard, science fiction novels like The Lost World, so what we have coming is one of his finest stories that he wrote basically in between writing Sherlock Holmes pieces.
F. Marion Crawford, you write, son of American sculptor Thomas Crawford, you know where I'm going with this, right? And brother of writer Anne Crawford, Baroness Eric von Raby.
There you go. That's
I had no idea.
Aunt Baroness.
The upper berth is one of is very scary and.
And you don't want to take a cruise ship after that one.
No, not so much. One of the stories we talked about putting on the radio, but I had to reject it because it was so just incredibly gruesome, is His Unconquerable Enemy by W.C. Morrow. It's written in 1889, but it's really, really explicitly gruesome.
It is. It's about, I don't want to give too much away, but it's about a political victim who doesn't give up on the idea of revenge, and doesn't give up in circumstances that you'll find unbelievable, that the man could actually manage to take his revenge.
Yeah, and again, we can't even. It's unspeakable horror.
It is.
That's the best kind of horror, the unspeakable horror. You write in your introduction, this book also includes a
You
long-
underline things?
Oh yeah,
Oh my
absolutely.
God. Do you know
no,
what-
I annotated your annotations.
Oh my goodness.
It's very meta. I'm
You've
looking.
ruined the book.
I'm looking at In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe. No, but once you sign it, then it will be
Okay.
worth millions on eBay. Your book includes a long introduction about a survey of horror.
Yes.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
And you mentioned someone I had never heard of, a book called Varney the Vampire, written by James Malcolm Reimer, 109 weekly installments.
Yes. Oh, such a wonderful book. The second vampire story in the English language, not counting Byron's fragment of a poem. The first one, cleverly called The Vampire by John Polidori, succeeded 30 years later by Reimer's Varney the Vampire. It was a huge success. This was a penny novel. I mean, it was put out in these cheap paper installments. It was a huge success. I mean, it's terrible. It's awful. But it was enormously popular and made into a stage play. And vampires were really the rage of sort of the middle of the 19th century.
Can I read the purple prose?
Oh, be my guest.
That's how you set it up. The first novel-length account of a vampire in English, the prose of Varney is sensational. Her bosom heaves and her limbs tremble, yet she cannot withdraw her eyes from that marble-looking face. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. A gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. The girl has swooned, and the vampire is at his hideous repast.
And you could get it for only a shilling.
Our last story tonight is The Leather Funnel by Arthur Conan Doyle, written in 1902 when he was between Holmeses. In this story, an antique relic is the gateway to the horror, and that's something that M.R. James, who's also in this collection, did to great effect.
They were friends. Doyle was one of the leaders of the literary circles of England, and they wrote these kind of stories in part, I think, for each other. Not just he and James, but the whole circle. They loved each other's work. They cheered each other on. It was really a lovely time to be a writer, I think. Much as it is today, writers had the attitude that they were all in it together, and the success of one didn't mean the failure of others. There was a very broad market for stories, and Doyle was a great storyteller. He is, unfortunately, he had the wrong ideas about what was the quality work that he was producing. He thought it was his historical novels like The White Company, that's what he'd be remembered for, when of course everybody remembers him for Sherlock Holmes. But he was a natural-born teller of tales, and he's shown in almost every genre that he took up.
Before we hear the Doyle story, I did want to talk a little bit about M.R. James. who wrote something, what are there, about 15 stories about, and they're all based on a person finding,
An antiquarian. It's a they're,
yeah,
they're-
ghost
I found
stories
the
of an
exact-
antiquary.
Right.
And somebody finds some little thing
An
in an
object,
antique
yes.
store or somewhere, and it spawns the story. Do you think he invented that?
No,
he certainly
no. There's
executed
many
it.
other stories about objects. One of the earliest stories I have in the book is called "The Mummy's Foot" by Théodore Gautier, about exactly the same idea: an item found in an antique shop. But it was a popular idea because relics, totems were a well-known concept. But James took it to near perfection.
To read an adapted version of The Leather Funnel by Arthur Conan Doyle, our last horror story of the night, an actor best known for his work on Grimm, 24 Hours, Barbershop, and for his long association with director John Sayles from The Brother from Another Planet to Sunshine State. Please welcome Tom Wright.
My friend, Lionel Dockery, lived in the Avenue de Wagram, Paris. His house was that small one with the iron railings and grass plot in front of it on the left-hand side as you passed down from the Arc de Triomphe. It was here that Dockery had that singular library of occult literature and the fantastic curiosities which served as a hobby for himself and an amusement for his friends. His tastes leaned toward the marvelous and monstrous, and I have heard that his experiments in the direction of the unknown have passed all the bounds of civilization and of decorum. It is not with his complex character that I have to deal, but with the very strange and inexplicable incident which had its rise in my visit to him in the early spring of the year '82. "I have only that one spare couch," said he, pointing to a broad sofa in his large salon. "I hope that you will manage to be comfortable there. If the fittings are neither convenient nor conventional, they are at least costly," he said, looking round at his shelves. "I have expended nearly $250,000 of money upon these objects which surround you. Books, weapons, gems, carvings, tapestries, images. There is hardly a thing here which has not its history, and it is generally one worth telling." A half-rolled palimpsest lay in the center, and around it were many quaint articles of bric-a-brac. One of these was a large funnel, such as is used for filling wine casks. "Well, that is a curious thing," I remarked. "What is the history of that?" "Ah," said he, "it is the very question which I have had occasion to ask myself. I would give a good deal to know. Take it in your hands and examine it." I did so, and found that what I had imagined to be wood was in reality leather, though age had dried it into an extreme hardness. "What do you make of it?" asked Dockery. "I should imagine that it belonged to some vintner or maltster in the Middle Ages," said I. "I dare say the date would be about the same," said Dockery, "and no doubt also it was used for filling a vessel with liquid. If my suspicions are correct, however, it was a queer vintner who used it in a very singular cask which was filled. Do you observe nothing strange at the spout end?" As I held it to the light, I observed that a spot, some 5 inches above the brass tip, the narrow neck of the leather funnel was all haggled and scored, as if someone had notched it round with a blunt knife. Only at that point was there any roughening of the dead black surface. "Someone has tried to cut off the neck." "Would you call it a cut?" "It is torn and lacerated. It must have taken some strength to leave these marks on such tough material, whatever the instrument may have been. But what do you think of it? I can tell that you know more than you say." Dockery smiled, and his little eyes twinkled with knowledge. Have you included the psychology of dreams among your learned studies? He asked. A science of charlatans, I said. The charlatan is always the pioneer, he retorted. The quack of yesterday is the professor of tomorrow. Supposing that is so, I said, what has the science of dreams to do with a large, black, brass-rimmed funnel? I have more than once received important information through my dreams, said my companion in the didactic manner which he loved to affect. I make it a rule now, when I am in doubt upon any material point, to place the article in question beside me as I sleep and to hope for some enlightenment. You mean, for example, that if I slept beside that old sword upon the wall, I might dream of some bloody incident in which that very sword took part? An excellent example, for, as a matter of fact, that sword was used in that fashion by me, and I saw in my sleep the death of its owner, who perished in a brisk skirmish, which I have been unable to identify, but which occurred at the time of the wars of the Frondists. But to come back to the point, I slept one night with this funnel beside me, and I had a dream which certainly throws a curious light upon its use and origin. Might I ask you a very great favor? When you occupy that couch tonight, to sleep with this old funnel placed by the side of your pillow. Skeptical as I was, there was something impressive in the assurance of Dockery's manner and my extraordinary surroundings. The huge room with the strange and often sinister objects which were hung round it struck solemnity into my soul. Finally, I undressed, and turning out the lamp, I lay down. After long tossing, I fell asleep. Let me try to describe as accurately as I can the scene which came into my dreams. There was a room which bore the appearance of a vault. 3 men in black, with curious, top-heavy, black velvet hats, sat in a line upon a red-carpeted dais. Upon the right, looking toward me, was a small woman with blonde hair and singular light blue eyes, the eyes of a child. It was a curious face, comely, and yet feline, with a subtle suggestion of cruelty about the straight, strong little mouth and chubby jaw. She was draped in some sort of loose white gown. Beside her stood a thin, eager priest who whispered in her ear and continually raised a crucifix before her eyes. She turned her head and looked fixedly past the crucifix at the 3 black men who were, I felt, her judges. As I gazed, the 3 men swept out of the room. There appeared a new figure upon the scene. This was a tall, thin person clad in black, with a gaunt and austere face. His clothes were all shining with grease and mottled with stains. He carried a coil of light ropes over his left forearm. The lady looked him up and down with a searching glance, but her expression was unchanged. It was confident, even defiant. Taking one of the cords from his left arm, he bound the woman's hands together. She held them meekly toward him as he did so. Then he took her arm with a rough grip and led her toward a wooden horse, which was a little higher than her waist. Onto this she was lifted and laid, with her back upon it and her face to the ceiling. The woman's lips were moving rapidly, and though I could hear nothing, I knew that she was praying. Her feet hung down either side of the horse, and I saw that the rough varlets in attendance had fastened cords to her ankles and secured the other ends to iron rings in the stone floor. My heart sank within me as I saw these ominous preparations, and yet I was held by the fascination of horror, and I could not take my eyes from the strange spectacle. A man had entered the room with a bucket of water in either hand. Another followed with a 3rd bucket. They were laid beside the wooden horse. The second man had a wooden dipper, a bowl with a straight handle, in his other hand. This he gave to the man in black. At the same moment, one of the varlets approached with a dark object in his hand, which even in my dream filled me with a vague feeling of familiarity. It was the leather funnel. With horrible energy, he thrust it, but I could stand no more. My hair stood on end with horror. I writhed, I struggled, I broke through the bonds of sleep, and I burst with a shriek into my own life and found myself lying shivering with terror in the huge library, with the moonlight flooding through the window and throwing strange silver and black traceries upon the opposite wall. Oh, what a blessed relief. To feel that I was back in the 19th century, back out of that medieval vault into a world where men had human hearts within their bosoms. Was it all a fantasy? Or did it really stand for something which had happened in the black, cruel days of the world's history? And then, suddenly, my heart seemed to stand still in my bosom, and I could not even scream, so great was my terror. Something was advancing toward me through the darkness of the room. And then it moved out into the white lane of moonlight, and I breathed once more. It was Dockery, and his face showed that he was as frightened as myself. "Was that you? For God's sake, what's the matter?" he asked in a husky voice. "Oh, Dockery, I am so glad to see you. I have been down into hell. It was dreadful." "The leather funnel has acted, then," Dockery chuckled. "I suppose from what you say that you have seen the whole dreadful business." "What dreadful business?" "The torture of the water, the extraordinary question, as it was called in the genial days of the Sun King. Did you stand it out to the end?" "No, thank God. I awoke before it really began." "Ah, well, it is just as well for you. I held out to the third bucket. I suppose that you have no idea what it was that you have seen." "The torture of some criminal. She must have been a terrible malefactor indeed if her crimes are in proportion to her penalty." "She was, and they were, if I am correct in the lady's identity." "But who, then, is this lady whose appearance was so attractive and whose end was so horrible?" "None other than Marie-Madeleine de Aubray, Marquis de Bouvilliers, one of the most famous poisoners and murderers of all time." I sat in silence, overwhelmed at the extraordinary nature of the incident. In a vague way, I remembered some details of the woman's career, her unbridled debauchery, the cold-blooded and protracted torture of her sick father, the murder of her brothers for motives of petty gain. I recollected also that the bravery of her end had done something to atone for the horror of her life, and that all Paris had sympathized with her last moments, and blessed her as a martyr within a few days of the time when they had cursed her as a murderess. "And this?" I asked, pointing to the marks upon the leathern neck. "She was a cruel tigress," said Dockery, as he turned away. "I think it is evident that, like other tigresses, her teeth were both strong and sharp."
That's Tom Wright reading an adapted version of The Leather Funnel by Arthur Conan Doyle, based on a true story.
Yes, and this is one of those "don't try this at home" kids.
So there was a woman who possibly poisoned more than 50 people.
Yes, he pronounced the name so much better than I can, but the Marquise de Brinville, something like that. Actually, Holmes mentions her to Watson in one of the stories. She was an infamous poisoner, much more sinister than, for example, the Borgia lady. Lucretia was nothing, an amateur compared to the Marchioness.
And in your book, you print her quote, what she said about this. Half the people of quality are involved in this sort of thing.
Well, it was the Sun King's reign, and it was a good time.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you.
And that's Off Ramp for another week. Special thanks to Les Klinger and to our readers, L. Scott Campbell, Van Dyke Parks, and Tom Wright for their generosity and talent. Thanks to Actors Equity and SAG-AFTRA for making it easy tonight. The live events team at the Crawford Family Forum is John Cohn, Liz Brown, Dave McKeever, and Haley Waters. Off Ramp is Kevin Ferguson, Chris Greenspan, and Mark Pampinen. We're online at iTunes and at kpcc.org/offramp, and we're back next week, Saturday at noon and Sunday night at 6. I'm John Raby. Thanks for listening.